everybody, my name is Kara. I'm here today to talk to you about assessment terms, especially ones involving literacy in the modern day classroom. So let's first talk about what is a literacy assessment. So literacy is one's ability to be able to read or write. An assessment is the evaluation or estimations of one's ability of something. So in this case, one's ability of reading or writing. Some normal literacy assessments we see in the modern day classroom involve using some kind of standardized procedures that require administering and scoring the assessment in the same way for most students. An example of a formal assessment is a state test, which evaluate proficiency in one or more literacy domains such as reading, writing, and listening. During the administration of state testings, students are all given the same test at their grade level. Teachers read the same directions in the same way to all students, and the students are given the same amount of time, unless the students receive accommodations. It's used in intermediate intervention and remediation because each state specifies the standards that students should meet at each grade level, and state test scores reflect how well students achieve in relation to these standards. For example, in Florida, we take the FSA, or the Florida Standardized Assessment. Students are scored on a level from 1 to 5. If a student scores a 2, it means that it would typically reflect that the student is not yet meeting the standards of the grade. Even though with a 2 they're still promoted, it just means that they're being promoted and they're still going to be struggling. Also in Florida, when the students first take the FSA or the Literacy ELA 1, if they score a 1, that's a mandatory retention in 3rd grade because it also shows that they're not meeting standards for the literacy assessment. Informal literacy assessments are more flexible than formal ones because they can be adjusted according to the students being assessed or a particular assessment context. A specialist's role in this is they make decisions regarding with whom informal assessments are used and how assessments are done and how to interpret the findings of the assessment. Informal literacy assessments can easily incorporate all areas of literacy such as speaking, listening, viewing, and performing, rather than focusing more exclusively on reading and writing. For example, a teacher who observes, or a specialist who observes and records behaviors of a group of students, reviews them, and is likely to engage in informal assessments of the students' reading, writing, and behaviors to guide their instruction and make better choices about how the students are going to interact with the information that they're learning, so the next time they take the literacy assessment, they can show gains and growth in their scores. The next one we're going to talk about is a language assessment. So language is different than literacy. A language assessment begins even before we begin school, whereas reading or literacy assessments, students who haven't begun school yet aren't developmentally ready to be reading or writing, but they are developmentally ready to be using language. So a language assessment begins even before young children reach school. All of these assessments occur in the child's natural environment. There are no scores given to the child. The purpose for assessing infants and toddlers is to provide a record of a child's cognitive language skills, growth, and a child's approach to learning. They're used to monitor the child's development. So it's normal to see a child turn around 6 months and maybe say mama or dada, or start cooing before that, and using those cues to monitor how the child's developmentally appropriately. So when they get to school, language assessments that are given to them can be used. The purpose for assessing this is their cognitive growth. They're used to monitor their development. The first anchor standard of speaking and listening that students get when they come to school is being able to engage in collaborative discussion. Some research indicates that collaborative discussion increases comprehension, academic language, and English learners' emergent language skills. I believe this is true. I really enjoy using collaborative discussion in my classroom. I think how a child speaks to you is a direct reflection of how they can read and how they communicate and how they can write. They're all connectively intertwined with each other. So I feel the more a child gets a chance to speak and with their peers who are on the same level as them, above them, and below them, it can really gear their language. Some states require districts to do summative assessments in speaking and listening. An example is the PARCC test, P-A-R-C-C. The speaking listening portion is optional, while the Smarter Balance test, also another example, has a section on listening. Some ways that it's used in intervention and remediation is a practice called the total physical response. This is an effective approach, and in total physical response, students recite vocabulary words, spell them, and act out their meaning so that they comprehend the difference between the similar sounding words. So through the speaking, we can hear that ship and skip sound the same, and effective teachers or specialists model this new information rather than merely just explaining it to them. A specialist's role, more in detail, is that they assess the student's language growth, and that is more difficult than assessing literacy growth. Since more common core state standards became introduced, this is where a specialist role comes into play. Using strategies such as wordless books, book discussions, group talks, and collaborative discussions, videos, writing to end a story, and many more, these interventions help students engage in speaking and listening, engage for future learning assessments. Students can interact through language assessments by being able to do things such as recognize rhyming words, clap out syllables, and recognize words with the same initial sound. So that has to do less with reading and writing and more with a child's speaking and listening in a language assessment. The next one we're going to talk about is called the diagnostic test. A diagnostic tests are standardized, but they differ from achievement tests in that they determine a student's strengths and weaknesses. An example I can think of that we use at my school is called iReady. I know it's really common along a lot of schools, but we use it, we give it to the students at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the year. This monitors the students' growth as a diagnostic. In the beginning of the year, it shows us where they kind of left off, taking into effect also that summer slide that students usually go through. And then we take it again in the middle of the year to show the growth that students have made, and then again at the end of the year to show more growth that students have made. This is used as a remediation or intervention because iReady is really good at grouping students together based on the needs that they need. It looks at things like comprehension, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, and so much more to help us group these students with common needs so we can get in there and we can intervene before it's too late. Also, we use iReady as an intervention because it is an online program. When we have our small group rotations during ELA, students spend approximately 15 minutes on it, and the diagnostic that they took pinpoints their weaknesses, and then the iReady lessons pinpoint them more and give them lessons to teach those standards and things that they need that we might not get to anymore in an upper grade classroom. A specialist role in using iReady is that, or a diagnostic test, is that the fact because they're standardized, they're more valid and reliable than something like a running record that a teacher might be giving, where the opinion is kind of biased based on who's giving it. They identify students' reading levels. So like on iReady, I'm a second grade teacher. I see students who are testing kindergarten, first grade, second grade, some even the end of second grade, even though we're only in the middle of second grade. And most are norm tests and can compare a student with other similar characteristics, and they identify student weaknesses. And this is really used when we're making our groups and we're pulling those lessons on things that we realize that students need. The specialist can also use this data to inquire students' weaknesses and guide instruction around it. Students interact with this because the diagnosis test can be given in groups or individuals, and all group tests can be administered. iReady is given via computer, and the data is instant to the teacher, which I actually really like because as soon as all the students finish taking it, I can use that data for my groups, pull lessons that I need to, assign lessons that I need to, and really use it to help with hopefully remediation and not leading to intervention. So speaking of that, the next thing we're going to talk about is remediation. Remediation means to teach again the content that a student's previously failed to learn. So an example of this is I'm teaching whole group. I can tell through like ongoing questioning and informal assessing which students are understanding the standard and which students are not. The ones I can tell are not quite getting it, I pull them for small group and reteach it in a different way or differentiated way, so hopefully that they can understand it more. When a teacher recognizes misconceptions or errors in understanding, they want to quickly redirect students through explicit remediation of that concept. This is done early on and for the benefits of all learners during core instruction in hope of preventing any students from requiring more targeted, intensive interventions. Remediation is often guided by a form of informal assessment in order to recognize the student's understandings. An example of using remediation is to differentiate the way we taught it before during small group. I like to really gamify my teaching with remediation because sometimes students don't just get it. I know teachers don't want to just stand in front of a room and lecture. That's not the style that students learn with anymore. So gamifying my learning and giving different chances to interact with the content we're using really helps remediate and kind of get to each student at their own levels and bring them up to where they need to be. So that's really how it's used for remediation. And the specialists can use this because it helps us target those below level students who are kind of, my school calls them the Fab Five, which means that they're kind of right on the edge of where they need to be. So if we can remediate them early, hopefully by the end of the year we have with us, we can bring them up to where they want to be. And if remediation doesn't work, that brings us to intervention. And intervention is often identified as a formal process for helping students who are struggling, where research-based instructional approaches are implemented around very specific skills, deficits, and where progress is regularly tracked, such as through RTI or MTSS. An example of how I use intervention in my classroom is through our running record books. We get the students' level, and they're broken up into similarity groups of their capability level. I don't teach all of those groups. We actually send them off to other second grade teachers, like the A's will go to one teacher, the B's will go to another, the C's will go to another. Some of them will go to the reading specialist. I personally have the J group, which is probably one of the higher groups, but still not meeting academic needs. An example of what I use during that time is called Reading A to Z, RAZ for short. And once they're identified, they go into their group or put on SBT, school-based team, which means that they're identified as having a learning deficit, and they're given that tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 based on how much more intervention that they need. So with Reading A to Z, I can print books based on what I know my group's interests are. Like I know my group right now is really interested in animals. So I like printing animal books because this helps keep them engaged when it kind of seems repetitive to be teaching the same thing over and over again. And these books really just target what J's need. What do those J's need? Looking at the continuum of literacy, and targeting what those students need to be brought up to where they need to be. A specialist role to do this, teachers must know how to assess literacy problems, match interventions to particular problems, teach students to use reading strategies effectively and reflect on the effectiveness of their own pedagogical practices. RTI is a framework to identify students with diverse needs and for providing instructional services with a multi-tiered system of support. Students interact with this because they're being pulled out to other classrooms. They kind of have a different environment than just staying in their classroom all day. And the last one that I have on here, but you notice that it kind of just wanted to restart itself, which happens in teaching. Technology is not always reliable. The last one we're going to talk about is called progress monitoring. So the definition of progress monitoring would be when a student is receiving that intervention, they're being monitored throughout this time to hopefully see a growth. In my school, we use kind of like a line graph to hopefully see the trends either going up or down, and it's used to determine whether the students need to be moved to a higher tier, if they need more support, and what they need support in. So the example I gave before was reading A to Z that I use. Every week we have a comprehension check because my students level J need more help with comprehension than with like the phonics and the fluency. And it's like a 6-question, 5 multiple choice, 1 writing. And I graph their trends to see how they're following along. It's used mostly to check goals, monitor student progress, assess, and still assess what students still need to work on. So like if I see my whole group got question number 3 wrong, and I see question number 3 is based on central message, then I know my next week's lesson should be based around central message to help those students. A specialist role, specialists can administer the progress monitoring test with students during intervention and use this data to mostly guide instruction. And students can use this data to be responsible and track their own data and see how they're growing throughout the year. So those are the different kinds of assessments, especially based around literacy, that we use every day to help monitor and track our students' goals. Thank you so much for watching.